If I were playing the number, I remember my dad used to play the number. I'm going to play the number. Going to play the number today. The number would be 455 today. Somebody, anybody, 455, 455, Bueller. Yeah, Kyle Schwarber. Wow. Wow. I'll get to that in a sec. The Thursday poll question at Smerconish.com. Will President Trump's deployment of National Guard troops spur the sort of violence that would justify continued military presence? I'll say it again because it's complicated. Will President Trump's deployment of National Guard troops spur the sort of violence that would justify continued military presence? Is he bringing about the legal justification that today he lacks for the deployment of the National Guard? And is it all by design? That's what I'm asking. Exciting night last night. Kyle Schwarber, 455-footer in Los Angeles. The Fightins win. Game 4 tonight is at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Milwaukee and Chicago, their Game 4 tonight, the later game, 9. I'm glad the Fightins are the early game. I'm glad. I'm tired. I'm tired of staying up for all this. And not a good night in New York, in the Bronx. Toronto moving on. Detroit and Seattle tomorrow night, Game 5. There's always a way for you to win. There's always a way for you to win. If your team loses, it doesn't mean that you necessarily lose. BetParx and Play Gun Lake, the only sportsbook apps and online casinos that I use and recommend. Play blackjack, craps, roulette, hundreds of hot online slots, and any way you want to set up the wagers that you make relative to all this great baseball action and so much fun football. Oh my gosh, you've got Thursday night football tonight as well. I almost forgot. So much to keep us all dialed in. Wait a minute, what am I going to do? I'm going to click back and forth between football and baseball tonight. New casino users get up to $1,000 casino bonus back if you're down in the first 24 hours. It's betparx.com and playgunlake.com for details. You've got to be 21 and in PANJ or Michigan gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. So yesterday, 33,630 votes were cast. Who do you believe will be elected president of the United States first? A female or someone openly LGBTQ+? 82.61% of us, because I was in the majority, hooray, said it'll be a female. And I don't feel like I need to repeat the arguments that I made yesterday as to why I think it'll be a female. But in a word or sentence, there's a bigger bench ready to go of females. And I continue to believe that it's more likely than not that the first female elected president of the United States will be a Republican. I think it'll be a Margaret Thatcher-like Republican. Is it somebody that I see on the current horizon? Not necessarily, but I'm not ruling it out. I mean, I think there are a lot of talented individuals, Democratic, Republican, who could fill that, break that glass ceiling. But there's not one name in particular that I'm thinking of. All right, I'm totally into today's poll question, and I hope that you will be as well. Will President Trump's deployment of National Guard troops spur the sort of violence that would justify continued military presence? I don't believe that he has the legal basis now to do what he's doing in any of these cities. But it occurs to me, and this largely grew out of the conversation that I had with Admiral Stav yesterday, that if there are protests rejecting the deployment of the National Guard troops, and if they get violent, it may hand President Trump the legal justification that I believe today he lacks. I mentioned last week just having a chance encounter with a nice conversation with Governor Pritzker in California. He's, of course, knee deep in all of this right now. As a matter of fact, yesterday, President Trump called for Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson to both be jailed. Pritzker responded by saying he's a coward. He says a lot of things to the camera, likes to pretend that he's a tough guy. Come and get me. And the Chicago mayor said, quote, "This is not the first time Trump has tried to have a black man unjustly arrested, and I'm not going anywhere." I guess a reference to the Central Park Five? I'm not sure. Had the conversation with Admiral Stav yesterday about the deployment of the Guard. He expressed his reservations on yesterday's program. And I quoted from a Stephen Vladeck op-ed in the New York Times, Vladeck, smart guy, law professor from Georgetown, bringing into focus the fact that there are three legal references that it will be helpful to understand if you want to pay attention to the battle, which is absolutely going to end up in the Supreme Court of the United States over troop deployment. So legal reference number one would be Posse Comitatus Act, which limits the power of the federal government to use military force in domestic matters. So that's sort of the big picture context. Posse Comitatus is what you've got to keep in mind, and Trump needs to get around that. Historically, and this is what Stephen Vladeck pointed out in his piece that I quoted from yesterday and I'm quoting from now, he said historically, only in contexts where there's a clear factual predicate, whether because local authorities were overwhelmed by riots or were refusing to enforce civil rights laws, has there been a deployment of troops that's been justified. And what's going on right now is that you've got, first in Washington, the administration invoking the federal government's unique control over the District of Columbia National Guard in response to claims of escalating crime statistics. And we've talked about that. Crime's too high in DC, but much of the crime has actually been in decline more recently. But there's DC, then there's Los Angeles. In LA, the administration called out hundreds of Marines and federalized thousands of members of the California National Guard in response to the claims that authorities were unable to keep order, especially in the face of anti-ICE protests. And now the administration is turning to both Portland and Chicago, near where there have been these long-running but peaceful protests around visible ICE facilities. So how can he do this? Posse Comitatus, Michael, you just told us it limits the ability of using the national military force for domestic priorities. So that brings me to legal reference number two, trying to keep this straightforward and hopefully engaging. This refers to Title 10, which is the part of the U.S. Code that deals with the military. It's a provision that allows the federalization only when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And here's the key part. Again, I'm speaking now to Title 10. If you don't have the consent from local officials, the president can use regular forces only if unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impractical to enforce the laws of the United States. Okay? So yeah, hell's got to break loose for Title 10 to be valid. I don't think that these conditions exist heretofore. I don't think that they existed before the president deployed the National Guard into any of these areas. Now, and I think ultimately, as I told you, the Supreme Court is going to have to weigh in on this. But ultimately, and this brings us to the third principle, the president is threatening to use the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act, an 1807 law that gives the president emergency powers to deploy troops on U.S. soils to quell what the president deems to be an insurrection. We call it the Insurrection Act of 1807 because that's when President Jefferson signed it into law. The modern day version is an amalgamation of statutes that were passed between 1792 and 1871. Are we too far in the weeds today? I hope not. Don't worry. Here comes the medicine. We're almost finished. What does the Insurrection Act do or require? It can be invoked when there are, quote, unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the U.S. government's authority. And when the president deems those conditions have been met, the law gives the president the power to use the armed forces to take actions to enforce those laws or suppress the rebellion. You'll remember that President Trump threatened that he was going to do this in the context of the southern border and apparently was talked out of it by Secretary Hegseth and or Secretary Noem. I frankly don't remember. The Insurrection Act has not been used since 1992 when President George H.W. Bush relied on the Insurrection Act as a basis to try and quell the LA riots. But in that case, it was done in accordance with the mayor's wishes and the governor's wishes. This is totally different. So to sum up, here's where I'm coming from and why I've got this poll question today framed in the way that I do. I don't believe that President Trump, up until now, is justified in deploying the National Guard in the way that he has done so. However, where in Portland and where in Chicago in particular, and in LA, there has been protest against the presence of the Guard, it occurs to me, and I hope this doesn't happen, that if it escalates and gets particularly violent, it will strengthen President Trump's hand when it gets before the Supreme Court of the United States, because he's going to say, well, look, we've got a rebellion on our hands. We have an insurrection on our hands. And whether it's through Title 10 or the Insurrection Act, I'm authorized to take the action that I'm taking. That's it. Now you want to hear the wording again. Okay. Will President Trump's deployment of National Guard troops spur, cause, generate the sort of violence that would justify continued military presence? And I could have asked a different question, which is, and is it all by design? Does he realize this? Is he pushing these buttons deliberately? Go vote at Smerconish.com. That's the Thursday poll question. Please subscribe right here, right now to my YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube. Set yourself up for notifications. And everybody, Sunday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, Sunday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the debut of The Mingle Project, Episode 4, a discussion of self-sorting, and my special guest, David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report. I hope you'll be there for the launch. You can participate in the chat if you're there at 10 a.m. on Sunday. And if you can't make it at 10 a.m. on Sunday, anytime after 10 a.m., after its debut, you can watch Episode 4. I'm really excited about it, and we're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together in explaining how we became so fractured and how we can restore common experience. Thanks, everybody, for hearing me out on today's poll question. It did require some explanation, but I hope you get it now and that you're interested in it. All right, see you on radio.